It started with a portrait that was never meant to leave royal walls, a coronation gift personally approved by King Charles himself. But when whispers emerged that Prince Harry refused to display it inside his California estate, palace aides reportedly froze in disbelief. What seemed like a quiet family disagreement quickly spiraled into something far more explosive, exposing tensions that insiders claim had been simmering since the coronation itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the portrait had been arranged quietly through trusted royal couriers shortly after the emotional aftermath of the coronation, during a period when Buckingham Palace was still desperately trying to repair the widening fractures inside the House of Windsor. According to palace whispers, King Charles viewed the gift not as decoration, but as an offering of reconciliation to the son he reportedly feared he was losing more with every passing month. The portrait allegedly carried layers of symbolism connected to lineage, continuity, and forgiveness, carefully chosen to remind Harry that despite the chaos of interviews, memoirs, and public accusations, he still remained part of the bloodline that had shaped generations of royal history. But insiders now claim the response from Montecito created shockwaves behind palace walls almost immediately. Sources familiar with royal administrative circles whisper that Harry allegedly declined to place the portrait anywhere visible inside the California estate, triggering private concern among senior aides who reportedly understood the emotional meaning behind the gesture. What made the situation even more painful, according to various interpretations of the matter, was the belief that Charles had extended the gift during a period of personal vulnerability, while already battling health struggles and increasing pressure surrounding the future stability of the monarchy. Palace insiders allegedly feared the refusal would eventually leak, not because of the portrait itself, but because of what the rejection symbolized to the institution. And while Buckingham Palace maintained its public silence, whispers reportedly spread quickly through royal corridors that Meghan viewed the artwork as symbolically complicated within their Montecito life, where the Sussexes had worked hard to establish a completely different identity far removed from the rigid traditions of royal duty. Some insiders even claim quiet tensions emerged over whether displaying the portrait would undermine the image Harry and Meghan had carefully built since stepping away from royal life. Meanwhile, William and Catherine were reportedly informed discreetly before the story reached wider royal circles, with sources suggesting the future king viewed the situation as another deeply painful sign that reconciliation inside the family was becoming increasingly fragile. The emotional weight surrounding the portrait allegedly lingered inside palace offices for weeks, with aides quietly attempting to contain growing anxiety over what would happen if the story ever became public. Because according to those close to the institution, this was never simply about a painting hanging on a wall. It was about loyalty, about memory, about whether the final emotional bridge between father and son had already begun collapsing behind closed doors. But the portrait itself was only the surface of a much darker royal fracture, one tied to loyalty, legacy, and the wounds left behind after the coronation. Long before the headlines exploded, there were already whispers inside palace corridors that King Charles had prepared a deeply personal gesture for Harry, a symbolic offering tied directly to the legacy of the crown. Yet insiders claim the meaning behind that portrait stretched far beyond paint and canvas. It was never simply artwork. It was a royal olive branch carrying the emotional weight of an institution fighting to keep itself together. Reports suggest the portrait was quietly commissioned in the fragile months following the 2023 coronation. During a time when Buckingham Palace was desperately attempting to stabilize the monarchy after years of public turmoil, interviews, accusations, and emotional betrayals that had shaken the institution to its core. According to various interpretations from royal historians and palace insiders, Charles allegedly viewed the portrait as one of the most personal gestures he had extended toward Harry since the Duke and Duchess of Sussex stepped away from royal life. Sources whisper the king wanted the portrait displayed prominently inside Harry's California home. Not as propaganda, not as public theater, but as a symbolic reminder that blood, legacy, and royal duty could not simply be erased by oceans, contracts, or media wars. And behind closed palace doors, aides reportedly understood the deeper meaning immediately. The artwork allegedly contained subtle references tied to royal lineage, continuity, and the unbroken chain of the crown itself. Insiders claim even the positioning within the portrait carried emotional significance connected to Charles's reign, the future of the monarchy, and Harry's place within a family that remained emotionally fractured despite public silence. What made the situation even more delicate, according to those familiar with royal administrative channels, was the extraordinary secrecy surrounding the delivery itself. Reports suggest the gift bypassed traditional palace staff systems entirely, handled instead through a trusted circle determined to avoid leaks, speculation, or political complications before the portrait reached Montecito. Palace insiders allegedly feared that if the gesture became public too early, it would immediately be consumed by the same media storm that had already poisoned so much of the relationship between Harry and the rest of the royal family. But as weeks passed, whispers of concern reportedly began spreading quietly through Buckingham Palace. Sources claim Harry's delayed response triggered anxiety among senior courtiers who allegedly interpreted the silence as deeply troubling. Royal historians reportedly described the portrait as institutionally significant, not because of artistic value, but because of what it represented emotionally inside a monarchy already struggling beneath enormous pressure. For Charles, insiders whisper the gift was tied to reconciliation, forgiveness, and perhaps even regret. Some reports suggest the king hoped the portrait might open the door toward rebuilding trust after years of escalating public conflict. Yet within palace walls, there were already growing fears that Harry no longer viewed royal symbolism through the same emotional lens as his father. According to those close to the institution, the silence surrounding the portrait slowly transformed from uncertainty into dread, with aides privately worrying that the gesture meant far more to Charles than it ever could to Harry himself. And as the emotional tension deepened quietly behind royal walls, insiders began realizing the portrait was no longer simply a private family matter. It was becoming a painful symbol of two worlds drifting further apart with every passing day. But while Charles believed the portrait could heal old wounds, insiders feared Harry saw it as something entirely different, a reminder of everything he believed he had escaped. Behind the gates of Montecito, reports suggest the coronation portrait became the center of tense private discussions that allegedly exposed just how distant Harry's world had become from the monarchy he once served. And according to whispers from royal insiders, the refusal to display it was not impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, and emotionally devastating for a father already weakened by illness and institutional pressure. Sources familiar with the growing divide between Buckingham Palace and Montecito claim the portrait never found its place inside the Sussex household, despite King Charles reportedly hoping it would stand as a quiet symbol of reconciliation after years of bitterness, interviews, accusations, and painful public fractures. Instead, insiders whisper the artwork remained carefully stored away from public view, hidden from photographs, interviews, and even private gatherings, as though its very presence carried emotional complications too heavy to confront openly. According to various interpretations surrounding the situation, Meghan allegedly viewed the portrait as deeply conflicted symbolism inside the life they had built in California. Reports suggest concerns quietly emerged over what displaying such a powerful royal image would communicate to the public after everything the couple had revealed about their struggles with palace life. And while no official statement was ever made, royal insiders claim the silence itself became deafening. Behind closed doors, whispers reportedly circulated about emotionally charged conversations between Harry and Meghan regarding what the portrait truly represented. To Charles, it may have symbolized forgiveness, bloodline, and continuity. But according to sources close to the couple, Harry allegedly saw something far more complicated staring back at him through that image, a painful reminder of duty, expectation, and an institution he had spent years trying to distance himself from emotionally. Reports claim the portrait became deeply entangled with unresolved wounds left behind after Spare, the explosive interviews, and the growing perception that Harry's relationship with the monarchy could never fully recover. Some insiders even whisper that every conversation surrounding the artwork eventually led back to the same haunting question: whether reconciliation with the royal family was still genuinely possible, or whether too much damage had already been done behind palace walls. Meanwhile, according to reports from those familiar with operations inside Montecito, household staff were allegedly instructed never to discuss the portrait publicly under any circumstances. That level of secrecy only intensified speculation among royal commentators, especially after observers reportedly noticed the complete absence of the portrait in carefully curated family photographs and public glimpses inside the Sussex home. And within Buckingham Palace, that absence did not go unnoticed. Palace aides allegedly monitored the growing speculation with increasing concern, fearing that the symbolism behind the missing portrait would eventually eclipse the artwork itself. For the institution, this was no longer simply a private family disagreement hidden behind diplomatic silence. It was becoming something far more dangerous, a visible fracture between the monarchy and one of its own blood heirs, playing out through silence rather than confrontation. Sources claim even Charles's closest advisors quietly worried that the emotional rejection behind the decision would wound the king far more deeply than any public criticism ever had. Because unlike interviews or headlines, this gesture struck at something deeply personal. It challenged the possibility of healing itself. And as palace officials reportedly watched the emotional distance between father and son widen further, many allegedly began realizing that the controversy surrounding the portrait was rapidly transforming into a symbolic crisis for the monarchy as a whole. But the deeper shock came when palace officials allegedly realized this wasn't just about a portrait anymore, it was becoming a public rejection of the crown itself. When word of the portrait rejection reportedly reached Prince William, insiders claim the future king responded not with anger, but with silence. And within royal circles, silence can be far more dangerous than outrage. Because according to those familiar with the fragile dynamics inside the House of Windsor, William had already grown exhausted by what some described as Harry's endless war against the institution that raised them both. Reports suggest the news reached William quietly through senior palace channels already struggling to contain the emotional fallout surrounding King Charles's failed gesture of reconciliation. According to palace whispers, there was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive argument behind closed doors, and no immediate public reaction from the Prince of Wales. Instead, insiders claim William simply withdrew into the cold restraint that has increasingly defined his approach toward the Sussex crisis. And for many within Buckingham Palace, that silence carried enormous weight. Sources familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy reportedly viewed William's reaction as deeply significant because he allegedly saw the portrait not merely as a painting, but as one of the final emotional bridges Charles had attempted to build toward Harry after years of division, humiliation, and public betrayal. Royal insiders claim William interpreted the rejection as something painfully personal, not only toward the king, but toward the family itself. Because according to those close to the future monarch, the portrait represented peace being offered quietly by a father already weakened physically and emotionally under the burden of illness, institutional responsibility, and relentless family fracture. Catherine, meanwhile, reportedly urged caution as tensions inside royal circles intensified. Sources whisper the Princess of Wales remained deeply aware of how fragile the situation had become, especially given the ongoing public fascination surrounding every development tied to Harry and Meghan. Insiders claim Catherine feared that even the smallest emotional escalation between the brothers could ignite another devastating media storm capable of reopening wounds the palace had spent years trying desperately to contain. Yet despite her caution, reports suggest morale inside palace offices continued deteriorating rapidly. Senior courtiers allegedly described the atmosphere as grim, with growing concern spreading through Buckingham Palace that reconciliation between William and Harry was slipping further out of reach with every passing controversy. According to royal commentators, the portrait rejection allegedly strengthened internal support for stricter institutional boundaries surrounding the Sussexes, particularly among aides who believed the monarchy could no longer absorb endless cycles of emotional conflict without risking deeper damage to the crown itself. But the most painful moments reportedly unfolded during private conversations between Charles and William. Sources whisper the king appeared emotionally shaken after discussions surrounding Harry's decision, struggling quietly beneath the realization that one of his most personal gestures had seemingly failed to reconnect the family he had hoped to hold together. And according to insiders familiar with those conversations, William's concern increasingly shifted away from reconciliation and toward protection of the institution, protection of Catherine and the children, and protection of a monarchy entering one of the most emotionally volatile chapters in modern royal history. Palace aides allegedly began recognizing that the emotional wounds surrounding Harry were no longer isolated family disputes hidden behind palace walls. They were slowly evolving into questions about the monarchy's future stability itself. And while the public continued seeing carefully controlled appearances and diplomatic silence, insiders claim deep fractures were widening quietly beneath the surface of royal life. Because within the House of Windsor, unresolved pain rarely disappears. It lingers. It hardens. And eventually, according to those watching closely from inside palace corridors, it changes the relationships forever. But even as royal tensions deepened behind closed doors, the public had no idea the most painful emotional consequences were still unfolding inside Charles's inner circle. For King Charles, reports suggest the portrait was never about publicity, reputation, or ceremony. It was about legacy, about fatherhood, about the desperate hope that history would not remember his reign as the one where the royal family finally fractured beyond repair. And insiders now whisper that Harry's refusal struck the king with a quiet devastation far deeper than palace officials initially admitted. According to sources familiar with the emotional atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace, Charles had privately viewed the portrait as a symbol of forgiveness long before it ever reached Montecito. It was allegedly intended to carry a message that words alone could no longer express after years of public conflict, painful interviews, memoir revelations, and growing emotional distance between father and son. Reports suggest the king believed the gesture might slowly reopen communication in a family already collapsing beneath the weight of mistrust and unresolved resentment. But instead of reconciliation, insiders claim the rejection created a silence so emotionally heavy that even senior palace aides struggled to contain its impact behind closed doors. What made the situation even more painful, according to royal commentators, was the timing. Sources whisper the emotional blow arrived while Charles was already navigating serious health struggles, increasing constitutional pressure, and mounting concerns surrounding the future stability of the monarchy itself. Palace insiders allegedly feared the strain surrounding Harry's decision was worsening already delicate tensions tied to succession planning and the emotional balance inside the House of Windsor. Because beneath the public ceremonies and carefully managed appearances, reports suggest the monarchy was quietly battling exhaustion, uncertainty, and a growing sense that the fractures inside the family had become dangerously permanent. Royal commentators reportedly linked the portrait controversy to the wider divisions that had haunted the institution since the coronation, describing it as yet another painful reminder that the emotional wounds between Harry and the rest of the family had never truly healed. And despite the heartbreak allegedly unfolding behind palace walls, Charles reportedly refused to discuss the matter publicly. According to insiders, the king remained determined to protect Harry from further public humiliation, even as whispers surrounding the rejected portrait continued spreading through royal circles and media commentary alike. Senior aides allegedly worked aggressively to prevent leaks, fearing the symbolism behind the story could create another devastating narrative about division, failure, and emotional collapse within the monarchy. Yet despite those efforts, sources claim the disappointment surrounding the situation became increasingly difficult to hide. Insiders whisper Charles appeared visibly subdued during later royal appearances, with some commentators quietly observing moments where the emotional weight he carried seemed impossible to fully conceal beneath royal composure. According to those close to palace operations, the rejection reportedly affected Charles on a deeply personal level, because it reinforced one painful fear above all others, that despite his efforts, despite the gestures, despite the silence and restraint, he may no longer know how to bring his family back together. And inside Buckingham Palace, that realization allegedly created a growing sense of sorrow mixed with quiet panic. Because if a deeply personal act of forgiveness could no longer bridge the divide between father and son, then what possibility of reconciliation truly remained? Palace insiders reportedly began worrying that the monarchy was entering a dangerous emotional territory where symbolic gestures no longer carried healing power, only reminders of everything that had already been broken. And as the institution struggled desperately to preserve stability in public while absorbing heartbreak in private, one haunting question reportedly lingered through palace corridors with increasing urgency. But as the palace struggled to contain the emotional damage, a far bigger question suddenly emerged. Had Harry permanently closed the door on royal reconciliation altogether? Within the ancient machinery of the monarchy, personal heartbreak rarely remains personal for long. Because once the rejection of Charles's coronation portrait became known among senior royal figures, insiders claim the conversation shifted from emotion to protocol, from reconciliation to containment. And according to palace whispers, the old guard began quietly preparing for a future where Harry's separation from royal life might become irreversible. Reports suggest senior palace officials rapidly accelerated internal discussions about limiting Sussex involvement in future royal ceremonies, particularly as concerns surrounding trust, confidentiality, and institutional stability continued growing behind closed doors. According to sources familiar with royal operations, the rejection of the portrait was interpreted by some courtiers not merely as a family disagreement, but as a symbolic refusal of the monarchy's final attempts at emotional repair. And inside Buckingham Palace, symbolism matters deeply. Because within the House of Windsor, gestures are rarely just gestures. They become signals, warnings, indicators of what relationships may survive and which ones may already be beyond saving. Royal insiders claim William increasingly supported the idea of tighter institutional boundaries moving forward, especially after years of emotional turbulence that had repeatedly thrown the monarchy into crisis. Sources whisper the future king had grown, convinced that protecting the institution now required emotional distance rather than repeated attempts at reconciliation. According to those close to palace strategy discussions, the portrait controversy allegedly reinforced fears that every private royal effort toward healing risked becoming another public wound. And for aides tasked with preserving stability around the crown, that fear reportedly became impossible to ignore. The refusal also allegedly deepened growing concerns surrounding trust within palace operations themselves. Insiders claim senior courtiers quietly questioned whether future private conversations, gestures, or family communications could remain protected from eventual public interpretation, media speculation, or emotional fallout. That anxiety reportedly spread far beyond Charles and William, touching nearly every level of the institution as palace officials began confronting the possibility that the divide between Harry and the monarchy had evolved into something permanent. Meanwhile, sources whisper Catherine shifted much of her focus toward shielding George, Charlotte, and Louis from the escalating emotional turbulence surrounding the family conflict. According to palace insiders, the Princess of Wales became increasingly determined to preserve a sense of stability around the next generation of royals, particularly as public fascination with the Sussex divide continued intensifying globally. Royal commentators reportedly described the situation as symbolic of two royal worlds permanently divided, with Montecito and Buckingham Palace now representing entirely different realities shaped by conflicting values, priorities, and visions of identity. One world built around royal continuity, duty, and institutional survival. The other shaped by independence, reinvention, and distance from the traditions that once defined Harry's life completely. And hanging silently between those two worlds remained the coronation portrait itself, still allegedly unseen publicly to this day. According to insiders, the artwork has quietly transformed into one of the most emotionally loaded symbols of the royal divide, a portrait created to heal fractures that instead exposed how deep those fractures had already become. Palace aides reportedly understand that every month the portrait remains hidden only strengthens public speculation surrounding what it now represents emotionally for both sides. Because at its core, this was never truly about art. It was about belonging, about memory, about whether a family bound together by centuries of history could survive the emotional collapse unfolding beneath the weight of modern public life. And as the monarchy moves forward beneath increasing uncertainty, insiders claim one painful truth now echoes louder than ever through palace corridors. But while the portrait may remain hidden behind closed doors, insiders believe its rejection exposed something far greater, the painful reality that legacy, once fractured, may never fully heal again. What made the portrait controversy so explosive was not the canvas itself, but what it represented. To the palace, reports suggest it symbolized continuity, bloodline, and the sacred duty of the crown. But to Harry, insiders whisper it may have represented expectation, pressure, and a royal identity he no longer wished to carry. And somewhere between those two realities, the final threads of trust reportedly began unraveling completely. According to royal experts and palace commentators, the portrait allegedly became far more than a private family gift the moment it was rejected behind closed doors. Sources claim senior figures within Buckingham Palace quietly viewed the artwork as a symbolic extension of King Charles's reign itself, an attempt to preserve unity inside a monarchy already strained by years of emotional fractures, public accusations, and growing generational conflict. To the institution, insiders whisper the portrait carried the message that despite every scandal and separation, the bloodline remained connected. That the crown still believed reconciliation was possible. But according to those familiar with Harry's increasingly distant relationship with royal life, the symbolism surrounding the portrait may have carried a completely different emotional weight for him. Reports suggest Harry had grown deeply resistant toward institutional symbolism tied to hierarchy, obligation, and royal expectation after years of struggling publicly with the pressures surrounding his role inside the monarchy. And insiders claim that resistance only intensified following the release of Spare, where painful memories, emotional grievances, and unresolved anger reportedly reshaped how Harry viewed the institution that once defined his entire existence. Palace staff allegedly became increasingly worried that public sympathy toward reconciliation was beginning to fade as speculation surrounding the rejected portrait continued growing. According to commentators, many inside royal circles feared the controversy reinforced a dangerous perception that every attempt by the palace to rebuild emotional bridges was now being met with silence, distance, or rejection. And within the ancient structure of the monarchy, perception matters almost as much as reality itself, because public confidence in the institution has always depended on the image of continuity, stability, and family unity, even during periods of private turmoil. Yet the portrait controversy reportedly reignited broader tensions surrounding royal titles, ceremonial invitations, and the Sussexes' future connection to major royal events moving forward. Sources whisper discussions quietly intensified behind palace walls regarding how the monarchy could continue balancing public duty with increasingly fragile family relationships. Some insiders allegedly viewed the situation as proof that emotional reconciliation and institutional survival were beginning to move in opposite directions. Charles, however, reportedly refused to fully surrender hope. According to palace whispers, the king still believed peace with Harry remained possible despite mounting setbacks and repeated disappointments. Sources claim Charles understood better than anyone the emotional cost of royal estrangement, which only deepened his determination to leave the door open for eventual healing. But while Charles focused on preserving emotional connection, insiders suggest William increasingly prioritized stability above all else. Reports claim the Prince of Wales had become convinced the monarchy could no longer allow itself to be emotionally destabilized by endless cycles of conflict and uncertainty. And according to royal commentators, that contrast between father and son revealed the deeper truth behind the entire controversy. Because the portrait had ultimately become symbolic of something much larger than one broken relationship. It reflected the monarchy's wider generational divide, a collision between tradition and independence, duty and freedom, loyalty and personal identity. And somewhere inside that collision, the final emotional distance between Harry and the institution appeared to grow wider with every passing month. But the final chapter of this royal fracture would not be written through speeches or headlines. It would unfold quietly, through absence, distance, and silence. In the end, there was no dramatic palace statement, no public confrontation, no furious royal decree, only silence. The kind of silence that insiders claim now hangs permanently between Buckingham Palace and Montecito. And according to those watching the monarchy's future unfold in real time, the unseen coronation portrait has quietly become one of the most haunting symbols of a royal family struggling to survive its own divisions. Reports suggest King Charles has never directly addressed the controversy surrounding the portrait in public, despite the growing speculation, emotional fallout, and endless whispers that followed behind palace walls. According to royal insiders, that silence was deliberate. Some claim the king understood that speaking openly about the matter could deepen the fracture even further, turning a painful private wound into a permanent public spectacle. Others whispered Charles simply could not bear to publicly discuss a gesture that allegedly carried so much personal hope, only to watch it disappear quietly into emotional distance and uncertainty. And so the palace remained silent, even as speculation surrounding the portrait continued spreading across royal commentary, media circles, and palace corridors alike. Sources close to royal operations claim the artwork itself still remains privately stored away from public view, never displayed, never acknowledged, and never seen again after its alleged arrival in California. Over time, insiders whisper the portrait transformed into something far more symbolic than anyone inside Buckingham Palace initially imagined. It became a representation of unfinished conversations, unresolved grief, and emotional separation between two worlds that once existed under the same royal roof. Royal insiders reportedly admit reconciliation efforts between Harry and the rest of the family have grown increasingly fragile with every passing year. According to commentators familiar with the monarchy's internal struggles, the portrait controversy allegedly hardened attitudes within palace circles toward both Harry and Meghan, particularly among officials who believed repeated attempts at peace were failing to produce trust, stability, or emotional healing. Reports suggest the institution gradually shifted away from reconciliation efforts and toward long-term adaptation, preparing quietly for a future where emotional distance between the Sussexes and the monarchy might simply become permanent reality. Meanwhile, William and Catherine reportedly turned their focus almost entirely toward the next generation of royals, centering their attention on George, Charlotte, and Louis as the future faces of a monarchy trying desperately to steady itself through uncertainty. Sources whisper the Prince and Princess of Wales became increasingly committed to shielding their children from the emotional turbulence that has haunted the royal family in recent years. And according to palace observers, that shift revealed something profound about the monarchy's survival instinct. Because while relationships may fracture, the institution itself continues moving forward beneath the crushing weight of history, expectation, and duty. Royal commentators now describe the portrait saga as one of the clearest modern examples of duty versus independence inside the House of Windsor, a painful collision between personal freedom and the demands of royal legacy. To some, Harry's refusal symbolized liberation from an institution he no longer wished to serve. To others, it represented heartbreak, rejection, and the quiet collapse of family unity. But perhaps the most tragic part of all, according to insiders, is that the monarchy continues carrying invisible emotional scars while still maintaining the appearance of continuity before the world. Because behind the ceremonies, traditions, and carefully controlled public appearances, there remains an unspoken sadness surrounding everything that was lost between father and son. And as time moves forward, the portrait itself lingers like a ghost inside royal history, a reminder that even within the most powerful family in Britain, some wounds cannot be repaired once silence fully takes hold. And as the crown moves forward beneath the weight of history, one painful question still lingers behind palace walls: whether the portrait was ever truly rejected, or whether it simply arrived too late to save what had already been lost. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.